All right, seeing a quorum here, I'm going to begin the meeting. So we are convened. We are here today to talk about Common Core again, and we appreciate all of you being here. We want to thank Mr. Emmett McGroarty for being patient with us and trying to work out our sound issues. I would encourage everyone to move up as closely as you can to the front here so you can hear, and we'll do our very, very best. Let me take just a moment to give Mr. McGroarty an introduction. And then, Mr. McGroarty, we'll turn you loose and you can have at it, all right? This is Mr. Emmett McGroarty. He is Director of the Education Project at American Principles Project, which is dedicated to returning America to its founding principles. He is a graduate of Georgetown University and Fordham School of Law. So, Mr. McGroarty, with that, please give us your presentation, and you are recognized. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be presenting before you all today. And thank you, too, for your inquiries into the data issue and your concerns about citizen privacy. As you all have indicated by holding these hearings, these issues are of extreme importance. As we all know, data collection raises issues as to who has a right to certain data and therefore who can collect that data. By into certain commercial transactions and by visiting commercial establishments, do we grant rights to others to collect information on us for purposes of mining that data for marketing or research? Or is that information personal, and should the law read into any such transaction or visit an informational property right that cannot be collected without the express permission of the individual? Then, of course, there are the data security issues and the danger that data will be obtained and used for nefarious purposes. These issues are certainly present in today's topic, but there is a prior, and I submit to you, more important issue at stake when it comes to government involvement. That issue is the relationship between the citizen and the state. My conclusion, which I state up front, is that one of the pillars of the great American experiment, that is citizen-directed government, is at stake and in danger of being turned upside down. And without legislative action, and I don't ascribe a nefarious intent to those who wish to collect data, but without legislative action, the pervasiveness and power of government data collection and data mining, the nature of the relationship between the citizen and government. The citizen will be wary of government, much more cautious in what he says, in what he does, and in particular in his interactions with and teachings to his children. The great news, though, is that I believe America is at the start of an awakening. Citizens are becoming aware of these issues and are rising up to revive the American experiment. I've organized my presentation today to discuss the federal government's data collection efforts, how those efforts tie into the overall federal education and workforce plan, and how those efforts tie into private data collection initiatives. The federal interest in gathering student and family data makes sense from a certain worldview. Its underlying philosophy is in early 20th century progressivism. That view was that the modern world had become much more complex than the world that existed at the time of the American founding. The old principles were no longer sufficient. In the modern world, experts would be needed to address increasingly complex challenges. Under this view, education was something other than equipping children with the academic knowledge and abilities to reason, to understand and interact with others, to pursue the truth and to chart one's own course in life. Instead, education becomes part of a workforce development model. Now, a well-known recent statement on this issue was called a Human Resources Development Plan for the United States, drafted by Mark Tucker as a set of recommendations for the incoming Clinton administration in 1992. Lest you worry that I am getting off track, I note that Tucker served on the development team for the Common Core English Language Arts Standards. Tucker's argument is that an economy left to develop on its own with minimal planning and maximum individual freedom will be inadequate to secure America's success in the global competitive marketplace. He thus advocated, and I quote, a seamless system of unending skill development that begins in the home with the very young and continues through school, post-secondary education, and the workplace. As outlined in a Human Resources Development Plan, Tucker's vision included national education standards would be implemented primarily through inviting the states to submit proposals in a federal competitive grant program and then awarding grants to the winning states. A description with striking similarity to Race to the Top. In June 2009, right when the Race to the Top program was being constructed, Federal Secretary of Education Arne Duncan said, hopefully someday we can track children from preschool to high school and from high school to college and college to career. We want to see more states build comprehensive systems that track students from pre-K through college and then link school data to workforce data. We want to know whether Johnny participated in an early learning program and then completed college on time, and whether those things have any bearing on his earnings as an adult. To know all this, of course, we have to pretty much know everything Johnny does throughout his lifetime. We have to be able to control and study data. How do we know whether a certain program was truly successful or not? Don't we have to control for things like family income, marital status, family size, perhaps religious background? Those are things that a social scientist would want to be able to eliminate when studying whether a particular program was successful. Also, since we want to have productive employees, we know what makes a productive employee. Not only his knowledge and job skills, but also his social skills and the attitudes he brings to the workplace. Do some attitudes make for a less productive employee? Perhaps the attitudes that lead to being an entrepreneur are not the best attitudes for the workplace. Do certain attitudes and beliefs make for a less productive workplace? What about home life? Do certain attitudes and practices make for a poor learning environment? Certainly, the potential for abuse exists. Bear in mind, of course, what is a good learning environment can often be a subjective evaluation. So how is data connected to the Common Core? The problem for the federal government and for the associations advocating for the Common Core is that a federal statute prohibits maintaining a national student database. The federal workaround, and this predates the current federal administration, is to incentivize states to build identical databases so that the data can be easily shared. We end up with a de facto national database. So the first step in this process was in 2002 with the Educational Technical Assistance Act. There, the federal government began something called the Statewide Longitudinal Data System Grant Program to offer grants to states that agreed to build their student data systems according to federal dictates. One provision of this statute established the state. One provision of this statute provided for the grant program to help states design and implement their data systems. Through 4 rounds of grant awards, the federal government has dispersed $515 million to 41 states in the District of Columbia for this purpose. Then, in 2007, Congress passed and President Bush signed the America Competes Act. America Competes authorized grants to states to further develop their preschool through college and university statewide longitudinal data systems. The statute also specified that required elements of each state's data systems, including the ability to share data from preschool through secondary education data systems. Although America Competes did not require sharing of data among states or between states and the federal government, it created the structure through which such sharing would be more easily accomplished. Then the 4th round of the statewide longitudinal data system took place through the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, commonly known as the stimulus bill. That legislation created a state fiscal stabilization fund from which grants were made to the struggling states. They had to agree to use the money to establish and use pre-K through college and career data systems to track progress and foster continuous improvement. This legislation expanded the requirements for the statewide longitudinal data systems, mandating that grantee states track children from early childhood through the start of a young adult's career. And then finally, also through the stimulus bill, we had the Race to the Top program. Race to the Top started being implemented the following year in 2010, and in it, the U.S. Department of Education took $4.35 billion from the stimulus bill and funded its Race to the Top program. Among other mandates in the Race to the Top program, such as the adoption of the Common Core national standards and aligned assessments, the Race to the Top grant program established as a priority that the applicant state agree to expansion and adaptation of its statewide data system. Through Race to the Top, the U.S. Department of Education advocated establishment of sweeping data systems. Specifically, it stated that the Secretary is particularly interested in applications where state plans to expand to include or integrate data from special education programs, English language learner programs, early childhood programs, at-risk and dropout prevention programs, and school climate and culture programs, on, including school finance, student health, post-secondary education, and other areas. Also emphasized was the desirability of having all states build essentially identity systems. So this feature went a long way toward providing a workaround the prohibition on the federal government maintaining a national student database. To be competitive in the Race to the Top competition, the state had to adopt the Common Core standards, sign an MOU with an assessment consortium, standardized testing consortia that the test of which would be aligned in Common Core, and commit to and demonstrate its progress toward expanding its student database. Then finally, the Federal Department of Education expanded its data requirements through the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge, a $500 million competition, also authorized through the stimulus bill and funded jointly with the Department of Health and Human Services. The Early Learning Challenge was designed to increase the number of children through 5 enrolled in a government-sponsored pre-K program. Among other requirements, applicant states were judged on their commitment to building or enhancing data systems to monitor the status of children's learning and development from 3rd grade. So that kind of brings us up to in terms of the federal grant programs. And now I'd like to just briefly provide an overview of what kind of data the schools collect as a general matter. So every school collects information about its students. That's a necessity. So the students' file generally will contain items such as emergency contact number, allergies, and medical conditions, home address, and so forth. But schools also have become far more than education institutions, with many now including medical care and psychological treatment. And furthermore, 13% of students nationally have an individualized education plan, a document laying out how a child with special needs will be educated. And these can include medications, behavior analysis, academic and psychological test results, and so forth. So you get an idea of how personal and sensitive this information that is being collected is, and how important this issue is. So there's approximately 2,000 of these school-based health centers that exist throughout the country. Some states with school health centers provide parent waiver forms whereby parents authorize the treatment of their children. And some states also note in their forms that information can be released to the child's school and the school's agents. So that is another very sensitive topic as to who this information can be passed on to. So that is as an overview. And so I want to just outline some of the federal data guidance efforts. So these aren't necessarily requirements. These are efforts that the federal government is involved in to encourage a robust data collection. One of these is the National Education Data Model, which is developed by the National Center for Education Statistics, a part of the Federal Department of Education. It offers schools and states a template of some 400 data points to record about each child. And these include family religion, family income, bus stop information, voter registration status, health insurance, recording of the students' extracurricular activities, lots and lots of very personal data about a student. And again, this is a model. This is a model, a suggestion to the states as to what they should be collecting. And what is actually collected will vary from state to state, but some states are actually following this model in significant part. Another effort is the Data Quality Campaign. This is a national initiative that works with federal and state governments to implement its ideal data policies. In the 2009 stimulus bill, required every state to commit to building a longitudinal student data system that includes all 10 of the Data Quality Campaign recommendations as a condition to receiving federal stimulus money. The recommendations include giving each student a personal identification number, providing student-level information rather than aggregate data that is commonly requested by researchers and state education accountability laws, collecting student transcript information, and the ability to have K-12 data systems communicate with higher education and workforce databases. The Data Quality Campaign envisions that the future will mean using data collection and analysis to, quote, refine the Common Core standards and assessments over time, and use the new Common Core state assessment data to identify and share best practices and allocate resources accordingly, to share data across state lines to answer critical questions that inform policy and practice, and to evaluate the effectiveness of college and career-ready policies and programs to better inform policymakers' decisions and resource allocation decisions. Essentially, this means that it envisions using collected on children to change curriculum testing and school finance. And I note that Data Quality Campaign is funded by, among others, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is the primary Common Core funder, and the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, as well as companies like AT&T and Target. So finally, get back to the race to the top. It's the race to the top, as I think I said, required states that submitted applications to have joined one of the national testing consortia, standardized testing consortia that were being developed with federal money and were aligned with the Common Core. And you all probably know all this, and upon which the results of those tests would go along toward evaluating teacher performance and school performance. So in order to apply to Race to the Top, a state had to submit its MOU with one of the testing consortia. In the MOU, the state essentially committed to the Common Core. But the two testing groups, which are called the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, PARC, and the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortia, commonly called SBAC, both have very robust data collection requirements. SBAC says it intends to create a centralized data repository where all student responses, professional development materials will be housed, and all test results and other information will be generated and reported. For its part, PARC is constructing a similar national student database, which will receive data from state databases and feed data into state systems in a two-way connection, according to PARC's cooperative agreement with the federal government. Both consortia have committed, under their cooperative agreements, to make student-level data that results from the assessment system available to the U.S. Department of Education for research and other purposes. They have further committed through their agreements to provide timely and complete access to any and all data collected at the state level to the U.S. Department of Education and any agencies or organizations the federal government designates. And I note that in terms of its testing, ESC has said that it may, in fact, test for self-management skills, such as time management, goal setting, self-awareness, persistence, and study skills. Again, we're getting beyond academic knowledge and really into attitudinal evaluations. Participating states have also promised to change any state laws that stand in the way of implementing the National Common Core tests. Each state will conduct periodic reviews of its state laws, regulations, and policies to identify any barriers to implementing the proposed assessment system and address any such barriers prior to full implementation. And this could easily include state student privacy laws, and this will if they impede the flow of data across state lines of government agencies. So just to emphasize, the direct connection to the Common Core is through the national assessments, PARC and Smarter Balance. Both consortia have signed cooperative agreements with the U.S. Department of Education in which the department is allowed access to all student-level data that the consortium gets through the testing. This access is to be allowed on an ongoing basis for purposes including research. More about that word later. They will not be allowed to object to this. And indeed, they probably won't even be aware that it's happening. So the next general issue I'd like to take up is the data flow. Where might the data go? One example, and I think it's an obvious one given how the issues I mentioned at the beginning, is the Department of Labor. And in fact, the Department of Labor and the Department of Education have a joint venture called the Workforce Data Quality Initiative. The purpose of developing or improving state workforce data systems with individual level information and enable workforce data to be matched with education data. That's a direct quote. Student education data are to be shared to the extent possible with state and federal labor agencies to promote the goal of workforce development. Another troubling initiative, and this one is primarily funded by, once again, the Gates Foundation, is called In Bloom. There were originally 9 states in Bloom, although in the wake of parental outrage, some of the states, like Louisiana, have dropped out. According to its website, In Bloom was inspired by the vision of the Council of Chief State School Officers, one of the owners and developers of the Common Core standards. And it intends to develop technology to support the implementation of the Common Core standards. In Bloom seeks to build systems to better integrate data that are stored in multiple disconnected systems. One idea is to help teachers and parents access the data more easily, which is all well and good, but the other idea is to promote personalized learning with the development of digital learning products tailored to each student's characteristic. For this to happen, of course, personal data will have to be turned over to education technology vendors who create these products. InBloom, for its part, insists that it won't be giving student data to commercial companies, and that only the state departments of education or individual districts can authorize such data sharing. And that's great that they admitted that, but this again shows why what you all are doing is so critical and so important. In terms of sharing data, another very important issue to bring up is whether or not the student data will be anonymized. And I think the clear answer to that is it really doesn't matter. The data coming from the Common Core Assessments Consortia and the workforce tracking data showing which students participated in which education programs and then earned which salaries are necessarily student specific. So when they say that it'll be anonymous, what they mean is that the names will be stripped from the data and a personal identifier attached. But think about the purpose and structure of this. The idea is to track students, as they've explicitly said, throughout their lives and careers, and to constantly be attaching data from the child's experience to the data system. So they have to be able to identify the child with the child's data set. It may not be explicitly with a name, but it will be with some kind of personal identifier. Furthermore, nowadays there really is no such thing as anonymization. When there are multiple, and in this case perhaps hundreds of items in a database, the absence of a name or social security number becomes a mere inconvenience, not an obstacle to identifying the student. And there's many just extraordinary examples of data re-identification, including some in education. In Kentucky, in 1990, I think when cell phones were about 20 inches long, a researcher was able to match over 2,300 students who appeared on an anonymized list of test takers. And the match had 100% accuracy. As I said, this is almost 15 years ago, using the last century's technology. One scholar who has studied this problem has explained that utility and privacy of data are two goals at war with each other. Perfect anonymization is impossible, he said. So where are we headed now? One draft report, but it appeared that was posted on the Department of Education's website last February, is called Promoting Grit, Tenacity, and Perseverance. And the thesis of that report is that education must inculcate these qualities in students and that their presence or absence must be measured. It suggests assessments of physiological reactions that a student exhibits to stimuli, such as stress, anxiety, or frustration. These reactions, it suggests, could be measured through posture analysis, skin conductance sensors, EEG, brainwave patterns, and eye tracking. This is not going on to my knowledge, but the mere that the Department of Education sees value in writing about these things and posting it up on the website, I think should give us all pause that these are issues that the legislatures need to study and determine what needs to be done to protect their citizenry. The Grit, Tenacity, and Perseverance report also draws a direct line to the Common Core, noting that the math standards expressly require perseverance in struggling through problems. If it is in the standards, they reason, it must be measured. So that is, I think, a glimpse to the future of where things could go if you all don't act. About ago, I'll just conclude this section. About a year ago, the Department of Education hosted a conference to explore the possibilities of implementing Common Core with the help of the digital learning. And the CEO of one educational technology company was very enthusiastic about the future. He said, "We are collecting billions of records of data, pulling data from everywhere, tens of thousands of places. This data," he said, "will help us develop the 21st century skills." So that brings us to the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. This is a law that was passed in 1974. It's also known as the Buckley Amendment. And I note that in the race to the top applications, there were application drafted by the Federal Department of Education. It made reference to this law and said that any activities would have to adhere to this law. But then I submit to you, then the federal government then changed the conditions, I would say. And here's what happened. So FERPA, this law from 1974, prohibits the disclosure of students' personally identifiable information by either federal, state, or local education entities that take federal money without the written consent of the student or his parents, except in certain circumstances. So with this, it makes an exception. The FERPA prohibits this disclosure, I said, of personally identifiable information. So what is personally identifiable information? In general, it's information that can be used to distinguish or trace an individual's identity, either directly or indirectly, linkages with other information. Personally identifiable information is defined in federal regulations to include the student's name, names of parents or other family members, students or family address, personal identifiers, indirect identifiers such as date or place of birth, mother's maiden name, and other information that alone or in combination is linked to a specific student. So FERPA, as I said, generally prohibits the non-consensual disclosure of this information. So it provides some exceptions for what's called directory information, but even there, the law provides that parents can or should be given notice, an opportunity to opt out of disclosure of directory information. But then there's another avenue in FERPA, and that is an exception to the general rule that disclosure of information must not be made to third parties without prior consent. And that is the release of personally identifiable information to authorized representatives, certain officials, including the Secretary of Education and state educational authority. Under this authorized representative exception, non-consensual disclosure may be made to such designated entities that are protected in a manner that will not permit the personal identification of students and their parents by those officials. And the disclosure must be made in connection with the audit and evaluation of a federally supported education program, or in connection with enforcement of federal legal requirements to relate to those programs. Okay, that's what the law says. This law, as I said, was in place since 1974. The law is still in place. But as of January 3rd, 2012, the U.S. Department of Education promulgated new regulations that radically altered the longstanding implementation of this statute. In effect, turned it on its head. Under these new regulations, an authorized representative designated to receive students' personally identifiable information without consent can be literally anyone in the world. It can be another government agency, such as a Department of Labor or Health and Human Services in the state or the federal departments. It could be a foundation or other private nonprofit organization, a research group, an individual, or even a for-profit company, as long as the data were released in connection with an audit or evaluation of a federal or state-sponsored education program. There would be no requirement of obtaining parental consent before the release. Moreover, the new regulations expanded the definition of education program to include any program that provides education or training of any type, even programs administered by an organization or entity other than an educational authority. For example, a covered education program could be one administered by a juvenile correctional facility or a hospital or a college entrance test tutoring service. These regulatory changes mean that the U.S. Department of Education or a state Department of Education could designate a commercial education product to evaluate a particular digital learning program in a school and release students' personally identifiable information to that company, all without parental consent or even parental knowledge. Or a state might send such information to the state public health department to compare student health records as part of an evaluation of a drug abuse prevention program, even one not administered by a school. The possibilities are limitless. And myself and my colleague Jane Robbins have looked. We've found no prohibition on sharing this information outside of the jurisdiction of the United States even. So the new regulations also expand the permissible sharing of data in connection with research studies. So under these new regulations, FERPA would now allows educational agencies and institutions to disclose information to organizations conducting studies for or on behalf of those agencies and institutions for certain purposes. So this goes on and on and on. It also allows an entity that's received information to redisclose it to other third parties. Now, the Department of Education defends its decision to expand third-party access to student information in part by citing the requirement that those third parties must enter into written agreements promising to maintain the confidentiality of the data and to destroy it or return it within a specified time. But this requirement offers little guarantee that confidentiality will be protected. For one thing, removing the requirement that data sharing be limited to authorized representatives under the sharer's direct control, in fact, removes the most effective means of ensuring data security. And the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers commented on this. And this is hardly a fringe or radical group. They said written agreements will be virtually useless in stopping an unauthorized representative who is not under the direct control of the state or local agency from misusing the data for other purposes or redisclosing the data. The written agreements may be required to spell out how non-consensually redisclosed data should be used and released, but without the element of direct control, the state or local educational agencies will have no ability to enforce them. A chief state school officer could call over to her colleague heading the state labor or health department and beg the colleague to crack down on a rogue authorized representative working under the colleague's direct control, but there would be no regulatory assurance that the improper activity would stop or could be stopped. Similarly, a researcher conducting an independent higher education evaluation could not easily be stopped from using student records for purposes other than those envisioned when she was made an authorized representative for a legitimate evaluation. Another problem is that the penalties for violating a written agreement are, in most cases, minimal. Although the Department of Education notes that such agreements could include sanctions under state laws, such as liquidated damages, the only federal penalty is a ban on the discloser's access to student data for a period of 5 years. The unlikelihood of getting caught with an improper disclosure, coupled with the absence of serious penalties, further contributes to the data free-for-all environment. May a parent sue a school that disclosed their child's personally identifiable violation in violation of FERPA? No, only the U.S. Department of Education can sanction a school for FERPA violations, and the sanctions are limited to denial of funding if the Secretary has determined that compliance cannot be secured by voluntary means. When these regulatory revisions were proposed and opened for public comment, comments flooded stakeholders familiar with FERPA and concerned with student privacy. Again, I quote from the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. They warn that the proposed changes represent a wholesale repudiation of fair information practices. Well-settled principles of notice, consent, access, participation, data minimization, and data retention are all undermined by the new paradigm promoted by this proposal. The proposed regulations have been overwhelmingly influenced by the single-issue lobbying of a well-financed campaign to promote a data free-for-all in the name of education reform. The department has chosen to facilitate an unconditional surrender of educational privacy rights of American families and students. Nonetheless, the regulations were made final and are now operative. And I'll quote from Paul Gamil, the former head of the U.S. Department of Education's Family Policy Compliance Office. He made this objection to the changes. He said that FERPA clearly identify and permit only 4 entities to disclose personally identifiable information without consent. These 4 were established by statute and have been unchanged for many years. Thus, they need to be expanded by statute alone. While the rulemaking explains the desire to greatly expand the list of such authorized representatives, such a clearly defined and established statute cannot be expanded by a regulatory change. Such an expansive regulatory change to establish statutory laws exceed the legal authority of the department. But this was 2 years ago and running, and I submit to you now that the federal executive branch has become so expansive now that Congress has lost any ability to provide a check or balance to federal education initiatives. And we've seen that time and time again with the Race to the Top and program, and this FERPA example is a blatant example of this lack of check balance. And so I say it is up to you now to protect the privacy and dignity of the citizens of Oklahoma. And if you can do that, I think you will be a shining example to all the other states that are now looking at this issue. When the issue of student and family privacy is raised, the frequent and understandable reaction of most education officials is to recite that the state's privacy protections and limits on data collection are robust. I do not discount such efforts, nor as a generalization do I have criticism for officials involved in what is assuredly a very difficult and important task. What I do note is that the Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act, the basic federal student privacy law, is 40 years old, and many state statutes are also very old. I encourage all citizens and legislators to look at their state privacy laws and decide whether to update reflect modern technologies. Modern privacy law needs to specify what government can collect, provide a process for a person to correct the record, provide notice as to where information might be shared, provide an opt-in process or at least an opt-out process, and provide notice to the citizen as to
data has been shared. I also note that data policies and practices can be the subject of conditional federal funding. The best thing to do is to pass a modern, comprehensive privacy statute that spells out what can be collected, with whom it can be shared, and who needs to be given notice when data is shared. If you don't do that, then you are just giving the federal government carte blanche to request and demand ever more data requirements upon the citizens of your state. And I close by saying I gave a presentation last summer in which I mentioned that unbridled government data collection practices can intimidate the citizenry. And if that happens, citizens will be reticent to engage in the public square in direct government, and we will be in danger of failed the American experiment. And I say this with the premise that I don't think this data collection is going on for nefarious purposes, as I said at the beginning of my presentation. But still, the personal nature of what's being collected and what is hoped to be collected and the sheer volume of what's being collected, I think it can be very intimidating to someone who wants to or desires to get involved in the public square and to direct government, which is a pillar of our founding. So I made this point at a presentation over the summer, and afterwards a lady approached me, and she identified herself as a native of Puerto Rico. And she noted that when she was growing up, her father would warn his children to be on guard about their statements outside the home because of the common view in Puerto Rico that government was collecting portfolios on the people. And in fact, just over a decade ago, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, following in the footsteps of disclosures by the Puerto Rican government, admitted to having engaged in such practices for decades in Puerto Rico. So what you are doing today, I think, is of the utmost importance to the future of the public. I think that the people now are gaining a sense of the importance and magnitude of this issue, and they are rising up. I commend you for what you are doing. I urge you to have as many town hall meetings as possible to talk to the people of your state and get their guidance and input. And I hope that you all can pass a model law that will preserve the efficacy of citizen-directed government. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. McGroarty, for that presentation. We will now have time for some questions. I think you still have time to be with us, right? Is that correct?
Yes. Yes,
okay.
Sir.
We are a little bit behind schedule because of our late start, so we need to make these questions as specific and as brief as we can so that we can get as many of these so we can take a very short break and then have time for Mrs. White's presentation. So do we have any questions? I see Representative Mulready. So, Representative, you begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. I wonder, first of all, are you familiar with the legislation we passed last year here in Oklahoma, House Bill 1989, related to our data, student data?
I read it at the time. I haven't read it recently.
Okay. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. Or
well, this is my recollection of it, is that it did not provide for, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it did not provide for a means for citizens to correct data, to opt out of data collection. It did not provide a remedy to citizens for wrongdoing. Am I correct about that?
I think you are, yeah. Yes.
Follow up?
Yeah. Unrelated to that, I just had thought of that as we were working through this. So I have there's plenty to be concerned about with Common Core, but some of the things that you hit on and again, maybe the devil is in the details, but, when you talked about templates of 400 data points and rattled off a half a dozen data points, and I'll have a follow-up right here immediately, but, so I guess I'm wondering what specifically is troubling about that. The half a dozen you rattle off, to me, I've got kids in public school, and those are things we've been providing for probably decades. And then the second is along the sort of concerns about the evaluations. And one of them I know you mentioned was time management, and I guess that just caught my ear. And your quote was, "We're getting away from academics." As I look back on my education, gosh, there's a part of me I sure wish I had some of that, specifically time management skills as a late high school and college. So I wonder if you just comment on those two things.
Well, what it is getting into is really attitudinal evaluations of the student, whether or not they are hard workers, whether or not they persevere, do they collaborate well with others, and then on top of that, it is this information is going into the student's record, and I think that is going to be very intimidating to citizens to think that there is this lifelong record out there, portfolio out there about evaluations of their attitudes, whether or not they collaborate well, whether or not they're disruptive. And then these evaluations will oftentimes be made by they'll be subjective in nature. And how is a child going to have the right to examine these evaluations and correct the record? What if the child has very sincerely held beliefs that she expresses and that is viewed as behavioral, as disruptive. So we're moving from an academic environment to really assessments of behavior, and then tracking that, including that. Remember that's the big point of intimidation, is collecting these assessments, and then so you have we're switching from America, the land of opportunity and second chances, and I can grow and mature, and to really switching to I think there's going to be a tremendous burden on people wondering what's being recorded about them, and how they're being viewed. I think that's very troubling, and I wager that most people, the vast majority of people, would find that to be extremely troubling, particularly the subjective nature of it as well.
That's helpful. Thank you.